The message came on a Tuesday. It arrived the same way all conclave messages did, wrapped in ceremony, full of long words, and signed by 47 different species. It was delivered through the standard diplomatic relay station at the edge of the solar system, translated into 72 languages, and then forwarded to the United Earth Council in Geneva, where it landed on the desk of Secretary General Marin Voss at exactly 6 in the morning. Voss read it once. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still, for a long time. The message was not a request. It was not an invitation. It was a demand. The Galactic Conclave, the great coalition of spacefaring species that governed most of the known galaxy, was summoning a human representative to appear before the full assembly on Station Halcyon within 30 days. The purpose of the meeting, the message said, was to discuss the continued aggressive posturing of the human species and its refusal to comply with conclave safety protocols. At the center of the complaint was Earth's orbital defense grid, a network of weapons platforms and shielding systems that humanity had spent the last 40 years building. The conclave wanted it dismantled, or at least significantly reduced. They used very polite language to say so, but the meaning was clear. Voss called an emergency session of the Earth Council that same morning. The council chamber filled quickly. Ministers and generals and ambassadors took their seats. Coffee was brought in. Nobody drank it. "They're not asking," said General Adisa Kamara, head of Earth's Orbital Defense Command. He was a big man with a calm voice, and he laid the translated message on the table like it was something mildly interesting. "They're telling." "They always tell," said Ambassador Priya Nair. She was the one who had spent the most time dealing with the conclave over the years. She had more gray in her hair than she'd started with. "That's how they operate. They frame it as diplomacy, and then describe the consequences if you don't agree." "What are the consequences?" someone asked. "Sanctions, trade restrictions. Possibly a blockade of the outer transit lanes." Nair folded her hands. "They have the numbers for it. 47 species. Even if only half of them participate, we'd feel it." The room went quiet. Humanity had known about the conclave long before the conclave knew about humanity. That was the part most people didn't talk about much. For almost 60 years, Earth's deep space listening arrays had been picking up conclave communications. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Enough to understand the shape of how they operated. Enough to learn which species were powerful, which were afraid, and which were pretending to be one while secretly being the other. When first contact finally came, formally, officially, with ships and delegations and elaborate ceremonies, humanity had already been watching for decades. They had not announced this. It had not seemed like the right time. Since then, Earth had walked a careful line. They traded. They attended summits. They sent observers to conclave meetings and sent polite responses to conclave proposals. But they had not joined, and they had not stopped building. The orbital defense grid was the sticking point. To the conclave, it looked like aggression, a young species with a chip on its shoulder, arming itself against neighbors it didn't trust. To Earth, it looked like common sense. "We need to send someone," Voss said at last. "Not a committee, not a delegation, one person. Someone who can stand in that chamber and speak clearly." "Speak clearly or speak loudly?" Kamara asked. "Both, and someone who won't be impressed by the room." There were not many candidates. The conclave assembly chamber on Station Halcyon had been deliberately designed to overwhelm visitors. Vast ceilings, strange lighting, the seats of 47 species arranged in a great semicircle, all facing the small central platform where the guest of honor was expected to stand. It was built, essentially, to make whoever stood in the middle of it feel very small. Voss already knew who she wanted to send. Commander Yara Osei was 44 years old. She had served 12 years in Earth's Diplomatic Security Division, and before that, had spent 8 years as an intelligence analyst, specializing in non-human communication patterns. She had attended 7 conclave sessions as an observer. She spoke 4 alien languages passably, and read 2 more. She had never once, in any recorded meeting with any alien delegation, apologized for being human. She was called into Voss's office late that afternoon. "I need you to go to Halcyon," Voss said. "I heard," Osei said. She sat down without being asked, which Voss appreciated. "They want us to dismantle the grid." "I know. They'll have the whole assembly there, all 47 species. Some of them will be aggressive. Some will be theatrical. Some will try to make you feel like you're on trial." Osei looked at her. "Are we?" Voss considered the question carefully. "No, but they'd like us to think we are." "Then I'll go," Osei said simply, "and I'll remind them of the difference." She was given 30 days to prepare. She spent most of that time in the intelligence archives, reading. Not briefings about the Conclave's current position. Not policy documents about the defense grid. She went further back. Much further. She read about the Draenei Accords of 2189, which the Conclave had used to quietly strip the Pell species of their resource rights. She read about the Vulcan incident, in which a pre-contact civilization had been diplomatically persuaded to accept Conclave observation drones that turned out to be surveillance tools. She read reports that Earth's analysts had written years ago and filed quietly, waiting for the moment they might be needed. That moment, it seemed, had come. On the 29th day, Commander Yara Osei boarded a single Earth vessel, no escort, no fleet, and headed for Station Halcyon. She carried a small data chip in her jacket pocket. She did not look nervous. Station Halcyon was the kind of place that was designed to remind you of your size. It hung in deep space, at the edge of neutral territory. A structure so large it had its own gravity, its own weather systems in the lower levels, its own small forests grown inside pressurized domes. It had taken 300 years to build, and had been added to by dozens of species over the centuries. Some of the older wings still carried the architectural style of civilizations that no longer existed. Nobody talked about that much. Commander Yara Osei's ship arrived on the 4th morning of the 30-day window. She had come early on purpose. She spent the first 2 days walking the public sections of the station alone, without a guide, without an escort. She ate in the common halls, where crew members from a dozen different worlds sat together and argued about nothing important. She walked through the galleries, where the history of the Conclave was displayed in great murals and light sculptures, all of it framed, of course, to show the Conclave in the most favorable way possible. She read every plaque. She photographed none of them. She remembered everything. On the 3rd day, she was met by a Conclave protocol officer, a tall, thin being called Vaseth, from a species named the Seri, who communicated through a combination of spoken sounds and hand positions. Vaseth had been assigned to guide her to her quarters, explain the schedule, and brief her on the rules of the assembly chamber. Vaseth did all of this efficiently and without warmth, which Osei found perfectly acceptable. "The assembly will begin tomorrow at the 2nd station bell," Vaseth told her. "You will be escorted to the central platform. You are expected to remain there for the duration of the proceedings. The council members will address you in sequence. You are permitted to respond when indicated." "When indicated," Osei repeated. "Correct. The presiding chair will signal when it is appropriate for the guest representative to speak." Osei nodded slowly. "Guest representative, not ambassador, not delegate." She noticed the language carefully. "And if I wish to speak before being indicated?" The hand positions shifted slightly, in a way that might have meant discomfort. "That would be highly irregular," Osei said. "I'll keep that in mind," Osei said pleasantly. She spent that evening in her quarters, not reviewing notes or checking data. She sat in a chair by the narrow viewport and looked out at the stars for a long time. Then she slept well. The assembly chamber was everything the briefing documents had said it would be. It was circular, with a ceiling so high that the upper section disappeared into indirect light. The walls curved upward like the inside of a shell. The 47 delegation seats were arranged in a sweeping arc at elevated levels, each one built to suit the biology of the species occupying it, so that some sat high and some sat low. Some were enclosed and some were open. Some were lit in colors that humans could not see clearly. All of them, however, faced the same point. The small, plain, circular platform at the center of the floor. Osei walked to it without hesitation. She stood there and looked slowly around the room. She did not appear impressed. She did not appear nervous. She clasped her hands behind her back and waited. The chamber filled gradually. Species arrived with their delegations, some with many advisors, some with only 2 or 3. They watched her as they settled in. Several appeared to find her stillness unusual. The Gravik delegation, large reptilian beings from a system 3 sectors away, kept their amber eyes on her with what might have been curiosity, or what might have been something else. The Sarathi, small, 6-limbed, and collectively one of the most politically powerful species in the conclave, clustered together and spoke quietly. The Moon delegation, who communicated primarily through color changes across their broad flat bodies, cycled through several shades before settling on a deep thoughtful blue. Then the proceedings began. The presiding chair, a rotating position currently held by a species called the Veth, who resembled loosely extremely tall gray herons, called the chamber to order. The voice came through translation systems fitted to each position on the floor. Osei's earpiece rendered everything in clear, flat English. The first 3 hours were, in a word, relentless. Species after species took the floor. They spoke about the history of the conclave. They spoke about the importance of mutual trust between civilizations. They spoke about the long and careful process by which new species were welcomed into the galactic community, and the responsibility that came with that welcome. They spoke at length about the Earth orbital defense grid. The grid, they said, was destabilizing. It sent a message of hostility to peaceful neighbors. It represented a refusal to participate in the shared security arrangements that held the conclave together. It was, said the Gravik representative in a particularly long address, the weapon raised in the hand of a child who does not understand that the room is full of those who wish it well. Osei listened to all of it. She stood in the same spot for 3 hours. She did not shift her weight from foot to foot. She did not check anything. She did not look bored, though 2 of the junior Sarathi advisors later told their colleagues they had found her expression impossible to read, which had unsettled them considerably. She took no notes. She needed none. Several of the speeches carried open threats, though wrapped in the careful cloth of diplomatic language. The Moon delegation spoke about the difficulty of trade navigation in systems where defensive uncertainty existed. The Veth presiding chair noted that the conclave's collective security agreement allowed for coordinated response measures when member species felt threatened. A small species called the Irath, who had never spoken to Osei directly before, used the word consequences 4 times in 6 minutes. At one point, a recess was called. An aide approached the central platform and offered Osei water. She accepted it, drank some, and handed the container back. The aide seemed surprised that she had not moved from her spot. When the session resumed, the tone shifted slightly. What had been warnings began to harden into something more like ultimatums. The defense grid had to be reduced by at least 60% within 18 months. Earth needed to formally apply for provisional conclave membership, which would subject it to conclave security oversight. Earth's independent deep space exploration programs needed to be registered and approved in advance. The list was not short. And through all of it, Osei said nothing. The presiding chair had not indicated her. She had not been given a signal. She stood and listened and did not react. And the longer the session went, the more the delegates seemed to notice that their words were having no visible effect on her whatsoever. By the 6th hour, there was a tension in the chamber that had not been there at the beginning. They had expected fear, or at least discomfort. They had expected the small species to look small. They had designed this room for exactly that purpose. Commander Yara Osei did not look small. She looked like someone who had come a very long way, and was in absolutely no hurry to leave. The presiding chair finally called on her at the 7th hour. By that point, 3 delegates had given second addresses. The Irath representative had repeated the word consequences so many times it had begun to lose meaning. The moon had shifted from blue to a pale, agitated yellow. Even some of the conclave's own members had begun to look restless in their seats, perhaps sensing that the session was not going the way it was supposed to. The floor is now given to the representative of the human species, said the Veth presiding chair, in a tone that managed to be both formal and slightly impatient. You may address the assembly. Osei did not move right away. She stood very still for a moment, long enough that a few delegates shifted in their seats. And then she reached into her jacket pocket and placed a small data chip on the edge of the platform railing in front of her. She set it down carefully, the way you might set down a glass that was very full. Then she straightened, looked out at the chamber, and began to speak. Her voice was clear and calm. She used no dramatic tone. She did not raise her volume. She spoke the way someone speaks when they know they do not need to. Thank you for the time, she said. I have listened to everything that has been said today. I want you to know that I heard all of it. I will not be summarizing it back to you. I don't think that would be useful. She paused briefly. I want to start with something simple. My name is Commander Yara Osei. I was sent here by the United Earth Council as its sole representative. Not a committee, not a delegation, one person. I think you understand what that means. Several delegates stirred. They understood exactly what it meant. Sending one person to face 47 species was either the greatest insult ever delivered to the conclave, or a statement of absolute confidence, possibly both. I am going to respond to the requests that have been made today, Osei continued, but first I am going to say some other things. I ask that you allow me to finish before responding. What I have to say will take about 4 minutes. Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. The conclave was formed, she said, 312 years ago. At that time, its founding charter described it as a body committed to the peaceful coexistence of all spacefaring peoples, to the protection of developing civilizations, and to the equal representation of member species in all matters of shared concern. She let that sit for a moment. I have read the charter. I have also read what happened after it was signed. The chamber was very quiet now. In the year 2189, the Drenai Accords were ratified under conclave authority. The official record describes this as a trade agreement. The actual terms, which are not included in the public record but which we have had access to for 19 years, strip the Pell species of mineral rights to 4 inhabited moons in their home system. The Pell did not understand the full terms of what they were signing. Nobody translated the relevant clauses into their language. When they later attempted to challenge the agreement, the conclave ruled that the original ratification was binding. A low sound moved through the chamber, something between discomfort and alarm. In 2217, the Vulcan shipping corridor was reclassified as a conclave security zone. 14 independent species lost transit access they had used for generations. 3 of those species appealed the reclassification. All 3 appeals were rejected. The member species that had requested the reclassification, and who then gained exclusive transit access, had contributed significantly to that year's conclave infrastructure fund. Osei's voice had not changed. She was not angry. She was not theatrical. She spoke the way someone reads a list of facts, because that was exactly what she was doing. I have 31 more items, she said. I am not going to read all of them today. They are on the chip I placed at the railing. They are sourced. They are verified. Copies have already been transmitted to independent news relays serving 12 non-conclave systems, and will begin broadcasting in approximately 6 hours, regardless of what happens in this room. The silence in the chamber was now a different kind of silence. It had weight to it. I want to be clear about something, Osei said. We are not afraid of the conclave. We were never afraid of the conclave. We have been watching you, carefully, for a very long time. We know what you are. We also know that many of the species in this room are not the ones responsible for the things I've described. Some of you have been on the other side of exactly this kind of pressure. We know who you are too. She looked around the chamber slowly, deliberately, meeting the visual sensors or eyes of several delegations in turn. The orbital defense grid is not coming down, she said. Not 60%, not 10%, not one platform. You do not get to ask us to be defenseless, and then explain that it's for our own good. We are not children. We have never been children. We have been patient, We have been quiet. We attended your summits and listened to your speeches and replied to your messages with appropriate courtesy. We did this because we are reasonable, and because we hoped that you were too. But I want to say something now, clearly, so that there is no confusion about the human position after today. She reached up and straightened her jacket collar, a small, unhurried gesture. We don't negotiate with those who mistake our patience for weakness. We don't disarm on command. We don't apologize for surviving. And we do not, under any circumstances, respond to threats by making ourselves smaller. She picked up the data chip from the railing and held it up briefly so the whole chamber could see it. Everything we know is on here. Everything we've been watching. Everything we've been waiting to say. We are releasing it not because we want to destroy the conclave. We are releasing it because some of the species in this room deserve to know what has been done in their name. She set the chip back down. That is the human response. I am done speaking now. She clasped her hands behind her back again and waited. For 3 full seconds, the chamber of 1,000 voices said absolutely nothing at all. The first thing that happened, after the silence, was noise. Not one voice, but many, all at once, breaking out across the chamber in a dozen different languages, all of which were being translated simultaneously through the station's relay system, which meant that Osei's earpiece briefly became a storm of overlapping words before the translation AI prioritized and began sorting them by volume and urgency. The graphic representative was loudest. They were demanding that the session be suspended. They used the word slander twice before the presiding Veth chair called for order. The Sarathi delegation had gone silent, which was far more interesting. The Sarathi were known for many things, and silence in the face of chaos was not usually one of them. They sat very still, their 6 limbs pulled in close to their bodies, and they watched. Osei noticed this. The moon, white with shock since her speech ended, began cycling through colors rapidly. Their internal communications were happening in the color bands outside human visual range. But Osei's suit sensors were logging everything. She would review it later. The session is suspended, the Veth chair announced, loudly enough to cut through the noise. All delegations will remain in the chamber. The human representative will remain on the platform. Osei had no intention of going anywhere. The suspension lasted 40 minutes. During that time, she stood in the same spot and watched the chamber with quiet attention. She saw 3 different delegation heads leave their seats and huddle with others. She saw 2 conclave security officers enter the upper level and speak to the presiding chair's aide. She saw a junior Irath diplomat looking at a data screen, and then looking at her, and then looking back at the data screen, with an expression that, even through the alien features, read clearly as alarm. They were checking the chip. Or at least, they were checking what they could verify quickly. What they were finding was that it was all accurate. When the session resumed, something had changed in the room. The graphic representative was still angry, but the anger had a different shape to it now, less like offense and more like a person trying to decide which direction to run. The Irath delegation had moved its seat slightly apart from its usual neighbors, a small physical distancing that carried significance in their culture. 2 of the lesser-known delegations in the upper tier, species that had said nothing all day, were now speaking quietly to each other with obvious urgency. The Veth chair spoke carefully. The assembly notes the statements made by the human representative. These statements raise matters of significant concern that will require full review. In the meantime, the conclave requests, interrupted a new voice. Everyone turned. The speaker was Delegate Orun of the Sarathi. She had risen from her seat, slowly, formally, and her voice through the translation system was clear and precise. The Sarathi rarely interrupted. When they did, everyone listened. I would like to speak, Orun said, if the chair will permit it. The Veth chair paused, then nodded. The Sarathi delegation has been aware for some years that certain aspects of conclave governance were not consistent with the founding charter. Orun's voice was measured. She was not confessing. She was stating, "We have raised concerns internally. Those concerns were noted and then set aside. We accepted this because we believe the system imperfect as it is, was better than the alternative. She turned slightly, looking toward the graphics section. We no longer believe that. The information presented today, if it is accurate, and we have begun reviewing it, and believe it to be so, describes a pattern of conduct that cannot be addressed with an internal review process. It cannot be addressed by asking the human species to disarm, and then resuming normal operations. Something larger is required. The graphic representative began to speak. Oren held up one limb, a gesture so calm it was almost quiet, and the graphic fell silent. I am not finished, Oren said simply. That was the moment, several historians would later note, when the session changed from a confrontation to something else entirely. Over the next 2 hours, 4 more delegations spoke. Not to attack the human representative, not to defend the conclave's record. They spoke about their own experiences, things they had noticed, decisions they had disagreed with, moments when they had felt the weight of the conclave's larger members pressing down on the smaller ones. One delegation, from a species called the Neph, who had only joined the conclave 11 years earlier, described a negotiation process that sounded, in careful diplomatic language, very much like coercion. The graphic delegation walked out at the 4th hour. They did not announce they were leaving. Their representative simply stood, and the delegation filed out through the upper exit in silence. Half the chamber watched them go. The other half very deliberately did not. Osai watched. She had said nothing since her speech. She had not been asked to, and she had not volunteered it. She stood on the platform and listened, and when delegates glanced at her, which they did, frequently, she met their looks steadily and without judgment. She was not gloating. She was not triumphant. She looked like someone doing a job she had prepared for carefully, and was now seeing through to the end. The data chip, meanwhile, had been doing its own work. Osai had told the chamber that the files would begin broadcasting to independent news relays in 6 hours. What she had not mentioned was that she had also transmitted them, 30 minutes before the session began, to the private communication systems of 14 non-conclave species, civilizations that the conclave had been negotiating with for membership, who had been told very particular things about what the conclave was and how it operated. Those species were now presumably having very different conversations among themselves. By the time the 6th hour of the resumed session came around, 3 delegations had formally requested that the session minutes be transmitted in full to their home governments for independent review. The Veth presiding chair, who had spent most of the afternoon looking increasingly like someone who wished they were somewhere else, agreed to the requests. There was no more talk of the defense grid. Nobody brought it up again, not because the subject had been resolved, but because it had become clear to everyone in the room that the ground had shifted under them entirely. Demanding that Earth disarm now would be like demanding that someone hand over their keys while your own house was on fire. Osei picked up the data chip from the railing when the session was finally adjourned. She put it back in her jacket pocket. Then she walked off the central platform, the same platform she had stood on for nearly 8 hours without a break, and made her way toward the exit. Delegate Orun fell into step beside her. You planned this for a long time, the Sarathi delegate said. It was not a question. We've been ready for a while, Osei said. You waited until they pushed, the delegate noted. We wanted to be sure it was necessary. Orun was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What happens now? Osei thought about it. That depends on what you want the galaxy to look like in 50 years. They walked the rest of the way to the corridor in silence, and it was the most comfortable silence either of them had felt all day. The galactic conclave did not collapse overnight. These things never do. Large structures, political, physical, or otherwise, rarely fall in a single dramatic moment, no matter how much the stories later make it seem that way. What happened to the conclave happened the way most great changes happen, slowly, then all at once, and with a great deal of arguing in between. In the first week after the Halcyon session, 3 member species formally requested a full independent audit of conclave records going back 40 years. The conclave's administrative council denied the request, citing procedural rules. 2 of those 3 species then suspended their participation in active conclave sessions, pending the outcome of their own internal reviews. The 3rd species, the Neth, who had described the coercive negotiations in their membership process, did something more direct. They published their account. The news relays that OC had transmitted to were already running the files from the data chip. The NEF account added a personal dimension that the files alone did not have. It had names in it. It had specific dates. It had quotes from conclave representatives, preserved in the NEF's own diplomatic logs, that read very differently from the official record. The response across non-conclave systems was significant. 4 civilizations that had been in the process of formal membership negotiations quietly withdrew from those discussions. Several trade agreements were put under review. On 3 different worlds, public protests formed outside the offices of local conclave liaison stations, not violent, but persistent, and covered widely. Within the conclave itself, the damage moved along fault lines that had always been there. The larger, older species, the Gravic, and others like them who had been in the conclave since its early centuries, pushed back hard. They called the disclosures politically motivated. They called the Sarathi delegation traitors to conclave unity. They proposed rule changes that would have made it harder for member species to publish internal communications, which had the useful secondary effect of making it extremely obvious why they wanted that rule. The smaller and newer species moved the other way. 2 months after Halcyon, a group of 11 member species submitted a joint proposal to reform the conclave's governance structure. They called for equal voting rights across all members, regardless of size or age of membership. They called for an independent oversight body with the power to review internal decisions. They called for a new charter, one that said what the original had said, but this time with mechanisms to ensure it was actually followed. The proposal was rejected by the Administrative Council. The 11 species then announced that they were withdrawing from the conclave and inviting others to join them in forming a new body. 17 more species accepted within the week, then 8 more, then 5. The conclave, which had held together for over 3 centuries, lost 31 of its 47 members in the span of 4 months. What remained was technically still called the Galactic Conclave, but it looked very different, older, smaller, and very aware of how quickly the world had changed around it. The new body was named the Interspecies Assembly. Its founding charter was short, specific, and written in plain language that was then translated carefully into all 47 member languages before being ratified, which took longer than anyone wanted, but which everyone agreed was important. The charter said that every member species had 1 vote. It said that governance decisions required a documented majority. It said that all deliberations would be recorded and that records would be available to all members. It said that any species applying for membership would be told the full terms of that membership in their own language, by a translator they chose, before signing anything. It was, in the estimation of most observers, a better document than the one it replaced. The question of who should preside over the Assembly's first formal session was harder than expected. Earth was the obvious answer, and the obvious problem. Humanity had, in a sense, caused all of this, or at least had been the trigger. Some species were grateful. Others were more cautious. Several were quietly worried about replacing one dominant power with another, which was a reasonable concern that the Earth Council, to its credit, took seriously. Secretary General Voss sent a message to the Assembly's organizing committee before the vote was held. It said that Earth was not seeking the presiding role. It said that Earth believed the first president of the Assembly should be from a species that had experience being on the receiving end of the old system. It said that Earth would support whichever candidate the founding members chose, and would do so without conditions. The organizing committee nominated Delegate Orun of the Sarathi. And then, without much discussion, they nominated Commander Yara Osei as the Assembly's first presiding mediator, a role that was new, specifically created, and which carried no voting power. The mediator's job was to run sessions, manage procedure, and ensure that every species in the chamber felt heard. It was not a glamorous title. It was not a powerful one. It was, however, the role that held everything together, and every species that nominated Osei for it said in their own way the same thing. They trusted her to be fair. Osei accepted. She stood at the front of the new assembly chamber, smaller than Halcyon, simpler, with seats arranged in a full circle, so that no species was elevated above any other, and called the first session to order. It was not a grand speech. She thanked the members for being there. She read the first 2 paragraphs of the charter aloud. She said that the Assembly's first order of business was to establish its oversight committee, and she asked for nominations. Hands and limbs and lights and sound patterns went up around the circle. She called on the first one and wrote down the name carefully. Back on Earth, the orbital defense grid remained in full operation. Nobody had asked for it to be reduced. Nobody was going to. In her office in Geneva, Secretary General Voss watched the first session broadcast on a small screen on her desk. She watched Osei take the first nomination, and move to the second and then the third, her voice steady, her posture unhurried, the room moving exactly the way a room moves when the person running it knows precisely what they are doing. Voss thought about the long years of watching, the careful patience. The decision to say nothing until the moment was exactly right, and then to say everything all at once. She thought about the chip in the jacket pocket. She thought about a species that had spent 60 years being underestimated, and the quiet, specific, and very complete way in which that had turned out to be the other side's problem. Then she turned off the screen, picked up the next briefing document on her desk, and went back to work.